Hello everybody, I think it is time to continue this series of videos about Trump, Agent Krasnov and so on. So, Craig Unger, I think that's how his family name pronounced correctly. He is a well-known author who was writing about Trump involvement with Russian mafia in his book House of Putin, House of Trump, and with KGB in his other book American Compromat. So he is now running a series of articles documenting the timeline of Trump involvement with Russia. So it is called Trump-Russia Timeline. It is published on Substack. I will have link to the article that we will be looking at today, and you can, from this article you can actually read the whole, set of articles about this. So today we will be reading about 1985, 1986. The KGB sets its trap. The story behind Trump's first visit to the USSR. Trump melted immediately. Okay, so, and here's the picture of Trump in the Trump Tower, circa 1983, showing of Trump Tower, the crown jewel of his empire. So, as I wrote in an earlier post, there are important unanswered questions about what has happened after Semyon Kislin, an alleged spotter agent for the KGB, first made contact with Trump in 1980. The real issue was whether Kislin's overture to Trump, selling him 200 television sets for his Hyatt Grand Hotel from an electronic store with ties to the KGB, would lead to a more important relationship with the Soviet spy agency. To answer that question, I reached out to Yuri Shvets, a former KGB major who trained alongside Vladimir Putin as a classmate in the Red Banner Institute and served at Washington Station in DC in the 80s. Shvets, who left the KGB during the last days of the Soviet Union and had since become an American citizen, had a pretty good idea of what happened because he was familiar with the protocols that he shared with his colleagues in New York who, he said, were cultivating Trump. Immediately after selling the TV sets to Trump, Shvets said Kislin would have had to notify his handler about the transaction. This was standard procedure. Once Kislin's handler was activated, the New York Registratura, i.e. New York Station in the first chief directorate of the KGB, would get the opportunity to develop Trump as a new asset. So this is Shvets, the guy who was consulting Unger. If they followed procedure properly, Shvets said, this was almost certainly the point at which Donald Trump's name first entered KGB files. But I mean, if he was already given, I don't think that it should be the first time it ended. Because if they had some shared information from Czech secret police, they should have already had his name on file. I'm 99% positive that is how they started their file on Trump, he told me. Kislin would have gone to his handler and said he had an interesting contact. The guy is Donald Trump. He is young, ambitious, rich, he might have a future. I'm not sure that it was in 1980 that this thing took place, because I have seen that actually the first contact was in 1976. I'm not sure which date is the right one, because if he married in 1977 or 78, I don't actually recollect. But this Czechoslovakian girl, Czech girl from Czechoslovakia, he was already be in the crosshairs of the Czechoslovakian, the secret police, and KGB, but maybe they actually had this their own separate file in 1980. His young ambition, really, he might have a future. So you accumulate about 10 meaningful reports on the guy, Schwetz told me, and you examine them to see if this guy can be cultivated to the point where he can be useful in either of two capacities. Capacity number one, as a trusted contact. Capacity number two, which is more ambitious, as an agent. You want to know if this guy can be cultivated to the point where he can be brought to cooperate. At the time, thanks to the success of Trump Tower in 1983, Donald Trump was well on his way to become a national figure, albeit one who provoked mixed reactions. New York Times architectural critics savaged the gaudy crown jewel of Trump's real estate empire as monumentally undistinguished, preposterously lavish, and showy, even pretentious. But Trump, of course, loved it. Trump was loud, vulgar, greedy, vain, and narcissistic. He was highly susceptible to flattery, money, and women. To the KGB, that meant he was perfect. He was exactly what they wanted. Trump was a dream for KGB officers looking to develop an asset. Schwetz told me when I interviewed him for American Compromat. Everybody has weaknesses, but with Trump it wasn't just weaknesses. Everything was excessive. His vanity, excessive. Narcissism, excessive. Greed, excessive. Ignorance, excessive. Old hands at the CIA agreed. Trump is extremely vulnerable to flattery, said Rolf Movat Larsen, a former CIA station chief in Moscow. He almost defines relationships entirely by who flatters him and who doesn't, as opposed to the intrinsic value of what people say. He doesn't care at all about the fact that Russians are masters at manipulation. Still, the KGB had no guarantees that developing Trump as an asset would pay off. Trump was just one of hundreds of assets they were cultivating. They could not have foreseen Trump's political ascent. The KGB played the long game, but they did not seek him out as someone who could be groomed as a presidential candidate and activated decades later. Instead, in the 80s, they cultivated hundreds of agents and assets in New York alone. It was like throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what would stick. Only time would tell if any such overtures would reap dividends. Still, according to Schwetz, Kislin's bulk sale of television sets to Trump had been enough to trigger interest in cultivating him as an asset by the KGB. The next step in recruiting Trump was to bring him to the Soviet Union. By 1985, the idea of going to Moscow was quite as daunting as it had been earlier in the Cold War. I think it was not quite as daunting as it had been earlier in the Cold War. Thanks to the ascent of Mikhail Gorbachev as General Secretary, it seems that the Russian bear had put on a friendly face. But Gorbachev's policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika restructuring masks the fact that the KGB, under the guidance of General Vladimir Khrushchev, a hardliner who seemed to be swimming against the tides of history, was still the most effective and most feared intelligence gathering organization in the world. So there are two pictures. At left, the USSR permanent representative to the United Nations, Yuri Dubinin, a hardliner known for his tonsorial quirks, was sometimes known as Molotov with the Pompadour. Okay. Right, Dubinin's daughter, Natalia Dubinina, shown here in 2015, played a key role in bringing Trump to Moscow. A compendium of memos entitled Comrade Khrushchev's Instructions Top Secret Files on KGB Foreign Operations 1975-1985 shows that by 1984 Khrushchev was deeply concerned that the KGB had failed to recruit enough American agents and that absolutely nothing was more important. Consequently, he ordered his officers to cultivate as assets not just the usual leftist suspects who might have ideological sympathies with the Soviets, but also various influential people such as prominent businessmen. As a result, KGB headquarters sent heads of stations a questionnaire itemizing the various qualities KGB asset should have. According to intelligence leaked by KGB director Oleg Gordievsky, defector Oleg Gordievsky, at the top of the list were high achievers in business and politics, particularly those whose profile include corruption, vanity, narcissism, marital infidelity, and poor analytical skills. And so, as if orchestrated by Khrushchev, the political education of Donald Trump began in March 1986, when Trump met the Soviet Union's permanent representative to the United Nations, Yuri Dubinin, and his daughter Natalia Dubinina. There are several accounts about what transpired, one of which comes from Natalia Dubinina herself, who, at the time in question, was part of the Soviet delegation to the United Nations. On November 9, 2016, the day after Trump won his first term, Natalia gave an interview to the Russian daily Moskovsky Komsomolets and said that when her father arrived in New York City for his very first visit, she met him at the airport and took him on a tour. One of the first buildings they saw was Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue. Natalia said her father told her he never saw anything like Trump Tower, that he was so impressed that he decided he had to meet the building's owner at once. Then, according to Dubinina, they stopped, got out of the car, went into Trump Tower, and took the elevator right up to Donald Trump's office. But there are problems with Dubinina's account. For one thing, if her story was true, she and her father would have violated every protocol in the books for the Soviet Union during the period of the Cold War. For one thing, as Schwetz explained, the arrival in the United States of a new Soviet diplomat, especially one who had never before visited America, was a big deal. The normal procedure would have been for Dubinin to be met at the airport by a delegation of Soviet officials and immediately taken to his office. Moreover, at the time, all Soviet diplomats, except for intelligence officers, avoided all unauthorized, unofficial contacts with Americans. The same rules applied to both the Washington Residentura, where Schwetz worked, and in New York, where Dubinina worked. At the time, virtually any Soviet citizen in the US was considered a ripe target for the FBI. As a result, making unauthorized outside contacts with Americans was a fairly certain way to get in trouble with the KGB and win a one-way ticket back to the motherland. It was a must. It was not a joke, Schwetz said. Actually, it was explained politely to the ambassadors that we care about your security because you know CIA, the FBI, they are bad guys. They can kidnap you. They can drug you, and under drugs you may tell state secrets. And then you'll be prosecuted. This is the reason why we need to protect you. KGB agents, however, were in a different category because it was their job to make contacts with and recruit Americans. After all, how could they possibly cultivate spies unless they were out and about? According to Schwetz, career Soviet diplomats who were not spies, the KGB referred to them as clean, rarely left their offices unless it was for hearing on Capitol Hill, a public presentation of some sort, of some report, or a run to the State Department to pick up official documents. So it was fairly easy to tell who among Soviet diplomats and journalists actually worked for the KGB. Natalia's assertion that she and her father blithely ignored such strictly enforced protocol is not the only problem with her account. At the heart of her story is the simple but false assertions she made to MK, Moscow Komsomolets. My father was fluent in English. Far from being fluent, Yuri Dubinin was famous for not being able to speak English. In fact, his failure to learn the language was legendary. It was cited in the Washington Post, the New York Times, United Press International, Chicago Tribune, Newsweek, and many other publications as being a highly unusual deficit for an ambassador in such a visible position. In May 1986, just 2 months after moving to New York as ambassador to the United Nations, Dubinin was given an even more prestigious post as Soviet ambassador to the United States. As the Washington Post put it, Dubinin's selection was a surprise because Moscow broke with its practice of appointing experts on American affairs and fluent English speakers to its top diplomatic job in Washington. Similarly, the New York Times noted that Dubinin's appointment as the ambassador startled some diplomats given that he had the handicap of needing an interpreter in conversing with English speakers here. According to Newsweek, it was only after he arrived in the United States, that is, after he and Natalia met with Trump, that Dubinin began to study English with a tutor. Even then, he needed interpreters to help him take questions in English at press conferences. Swedes who worked regularly with Dubinin's KGB colleagues in New York saw it play out firsthand. He even knew the tutor who was brought in by the embassy to attempt the hopeless task of teaching him English. Because Ambassador Dubinin didn't speak English, he just sat in his cubicle at the embassy without even leaving the premises of the building, Yuri told me. He was occupying the 3rd floor and he lived in complete seclusion. He was living as a hermit in the Soviet embassy. For at least a year and a half after becoming the ambassador, he didn't send any cable coming from the United States to Moscow because he said, "Look, I don't speak English. I don't understand what they're talking about on TV, what they write in the newspapers." Yet another reason to question Dubinin's account is Dubinina herself. In the late 70s and early 80s, Schwetz told me, the position in the United Nations Dag Hammarskjöld Library allocated to the Soviet Union was held by Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Yelagin of the 1st Department, North America, of the KGB 1st Chief Directorate. When Yelagin returned to Moscow in 1982, Schwetz, who worked with Yelagin for 2 years, says he produced a paper titled Using the UN Library for Collection of Intelligence Information. Translation: the United Nations harbored a nest of Soviet spies. Nor was American intelligence in the dark about it. All in all, the mid-80s was an extraordinary period for the spy game. In January 1984, 5 Soviet spies were uncovered in Norway and expelled. In February, Soviet diplomat Viktor Lisovsky died at the age of 63 after telling the BBC that Soviet intelligence had achieved a very substantial penetration of the UN Secretariat. Later that year, Soviet spies were expelled or outed in Ethiopia, Denmark, and the United States. The next year, 1985, became known as the Year of the Spy and was filled with enough espionage to keep John Lee Carr busy for decades, including the arrest of the John A. Walker family spy ring and the hunt for moles that led to the eventual unmasking of the most damaging spies in American history, FBI agent Robert Hansen and the CIA Aldrich Ames. In March 1986, the US demanded that the Soviet mission cut personnel because of concerns they were spying. According to Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, the Soviet mission had been widely infiltrated by the KGB, which led to the expulsion of 25 diplomats attached to the Soviet mission to the United Nations later in 1986 and a total of more than 100 by March 1988. It is also suggestive that Natalia had graduated from Moscow State Institute of International Relations, MGIMO, the prestigious Soviet foreign policy university that often served as a training ground for spies. Everybody is saying that MGIMO was, everybody who was learning English eventually was approached by KGB. And if they were learning English and were about to become a diplomats, they would be recruited by KGB for sure. The prestigious Soviet foreign policy university that often served as a training ground for spies. Moreover, when one studied Dubinina's CV, approximately 2 years of her life after graduation was shrouded in mystery. That was often the case, she had said, when for young intelligence officer who trained at the Yuri Andropov Red Banner Institute, the same spy school that trained Swedes and Vladimir Putin, who need to cover up those years with fictitious employment before they engage in operation work for the KGB. Moreover, Swedes also noted that Dubinina held Yelagin's job from 85 to 86, an assertion that that is corroborated by an April 28, 2003 profile of her on the Russian website AIV Express. All of which strongly suggests that, as Swedes point out, that Dubinina, far from being an innocent librarian, was actually working for the KGB. So she occupied the same position that was previously occupied by a lieutenant colonel of KGB. And since her father didn't speak English, that leaves Natalia as the likely KGB operative who made the initial contact with Trump during this period. Finally, if Swede's analysis is right and Dubinina was one of the first KGB operatives to reach out to Trump, why on earth was she giving an interview in Moskovsky Komsomolets just hours after he had been elected president? I know firsthand that Moskovsky Komsomolets was used for active measures by the Russian intelligence community, Swedes wrote me in a text message. I know their modus operandi, because I was trained by the same textbooks as Putin and those who are running Russian intelligence services. The content in the Dubinina interview was highly sensitive. It was not something the editor could print without authorization from the Kremlin. According to The Guardian, Moskovsky Komsomolets has aided both Soviet and Russian intelligence in the past in active measures, including publishing disinformation, suggesting that Alexander Litvinenko, the renegade anti-Putin FSB agent who died of polonium poisoning in London, may have been killed by Americans. Dubinina had kept silent from 1986 until the day after Trump's election, said Swedes, and suddenly she came out with a big interview published the very same day. Her interview with Moskovsky Komsomolets was an important part of a major Russian human cover-up operation designed to camouflage the roots of Donald Trump's contacts with the Russians. The significance of the Dubinina interview, Swedes added, was that it was the origin story regarding Trump's ties to Russia. Natalia was trying to show that it was her father who initiated contact with Trump, not her, and the contact was official and had nothing to do with Soviet intelligence. That was purpose number one. And number two, the KGB believed that Trump would read this article or a translation of the article. It was like a reminder saying, guys, we remember. And you see, we are lying. We are camouflaging our relationship, but we remember everything. Swedes added, the KGB modus operandi clearly shows that Natalia was a KGB officer, and her story in MK, Moscow Komsomol, together with some other Russian media publications, indicates that her interview was an attempt to cover up the true nature of the KGB contact with Trump. Dubinina has not responded to multiple attempts to reach her by the author by phone and email. Trump, of course, saw things differently. These contacts from the Soviets were nothing more than a tribute to his dazzling accomplishments. According to Trump's The Art of the Deal, at the 1986 luncheon given by the cosmetics magnate Leonard Lauder, he happened to be seated next to Yuri Dubinin. Trump later rhapsodized about the conversation in his ghost-written bestseller. One thing led to another, he wrote, and now I'm talking about building a large luxury hotel across the street from the Kremlin in partnership with the Soviet government. But Trump's accessibility to flattery seemed to have blinded him to the reality that a communist superpower didn't want to build a monument to conspicuous consumption in Red Square. It was all bullshit, said Schwetz, because the chances for his Trump Tower in Moscow were zero. But this is how they put people on the hook and say, look, I'd like you to come over and just discuss this thing with you. And this silly guy, he couldn't understand what's going on in Russia or in Soviet Union in Moscow. Yes, he's flattered, he's happy, he sees beautiful women, he's like a peacock. And that, according to Schwetz, is the story of how Donald Trump was invited to Russia. Finally, as I wrote in American Compromat, Schwetz says the letter invited Trump was written at the behest of General Ivan Gromyko in the first chief directorate's residentura in Washington. Gromyko, who died in 2009, was a high-level operative who headed the first department of the KGB first chief directorate. It was an established procedure for the KGB stations in the US to use Ambassador Dubinin to pass on invitations to Americans to visit Moscow, said Schwetz. Usually, those trips were used for deep development, recruitment, or for a meeting with the KGB handlers. In most cases, the trips were organized by Goskomintouryst, the Soviet government travel agency that was better known as Intourist and served as the front for the KGB. If the trip included all expenses paid by Intourist, it was a clear indication that the KGB was behind it. Trump was thrilled with the invitation, but there is no evidence that he was aware of General Gromykov's role or the widely known fact that Intourist was the KGB front that allowed the Soviets to arrange travel and surveil virtually any foreigner who entered the Soviet Union. Update. Several days after this article was posted, Dubinina responded to the author by citing a letter she wrote to French newspaper Le Figaro that addressed some of the questions posed in an article that cited my books. First, I have never met Mr. Trump nor participated directly or indirectly in the preparation of his first trip to Moscow. Second, I have never worked for the KGB. Third, I served as international civil servant and the UN in the Secretariat's Documents Department in New York from 1984 to 1986 and therefore never represented the USSR in the United Nations. It is worth noting that her response contradicts the account she gave to Moskovsky Komsomolets in 2016, in which she described meeting Trump and how she was present at the meeting in which her father flattered Trump like honey on a bee. Okay, so that was the article, and I think quite insightful, quite interesting, and it added some new ideas. But again, it's everything is showing that yes, he was cultivated, he was invited by KGB, but again, it is not known if he was an actual participant, if he was aware that it was KGB who was invited him, and that they were manipulating him using his that he was susceptible to flattery, and was he a willing participant in it or not? But we can see that quite a lot of evidence suggests that it was really the operation by the KGB, and that this woman Dubinina, the daughter of Soviet ambassador to United Nations and then to United States, she was most probably KGB agent. Okay, so till next time we will continue to cover this development, this series of articles, Trump-Russia timeline. Till next time, Slava Ukraini!